Hi guys, so this is my response to the Unit 2 content. So the first thing that I wrote down was that I found it interesting that it was said that approach is often neglected in general music. I find that my district's curriculum is more of an approach, and the lessons I create on my own would be the method. That's just something I wrote down. Um, I also like the quote, teachers should question such methods to determine if they align with their intended goals and with the ways children actually make and learn music. I find that if we do that and we're constantly reflecting and thinking about our end goal, that can get rid of those filler activities that we talked about in Unit 1. Another thing I liked was I noticed that in one of the chapters of the textbook we have, it mentions steel drums as a chapter. And when I was student teaching, they had a club after school that any student could join. So they did not have to be in a music ensemble. They did not have to be a percussionist. Any middle school student could join that steel drum club. And I thought that was really cool because they're not only reaching the band students and the music students, but they're trying to get the whole school involved in something musical. So about informal learning, when I was reading the chapter for chapter review, I chose a world music topic, and I thought about a project that I could do with students where they select a country and they could research that country, some of the music, and kind of choose what they find important to talk about and teach their class about that world music or that cultures that they chose music. And I thought that was an example of informal learning because the students are picking and deciding what's important and what's not important, and what they think their peers should know. There is a drawback to informal learning, and we talked about, or it was talked about that it was messy. And I did some projects that I think were kind of informal with some second and third graders this year, and I found it was very messy, and that the younger students did need much more structure. So I think informal learning and the messiness of it would be great for that secondary age group rather than the elementary. I have seen that Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk, and I saw that when I was an undergrad, and that still resonates with me. So when I'm creating lesson plans, I'm constantly thinking about ways that I can have my students giving me answers or ideas. So whenever I'm doing movement activity, I ask the students, what movement can we do now? And they get to choose and be creative and come up with that movement for us to do. Another another example I think about when I think about the killing the creativity idea was an example that was I heard from another colleague when I was in college, and they were talking about one time they did a Carnival of the Animals unit, and they would play the excerpt or the movement and ask the students what animal they think it was. And they would get very interesting responses that they weren't expecting. But one of their co-teachers would say, nope, that's not the animal, and would shut them down. Whereas if I'm listening to the elephants movement and a kid says a rhino, that's very close, and I'm not just going to tell a kid no. But also if they give me something that's not even close, say like we're listening to elephants and they say bunny rabbit, I'm going to want to know why they said a bunny rabbit. So I would dig deeper and not automatically say no. I would just want to hear why and have them justify their answer, and then see where I could go from that without killing their creativity and shutting them down. So that's just something I constantly think about when creating lesson plans, is how I can keep the kids being creative and not shutting them down. And that goes with creating a welcoming environment, because music class is really scary, and anxiety is really high in students these days. They have so much going on in other classes, so much testing, And really, anxiety levels and stress levels have gone up in these students. And so performing in front of a class, even if it's just a simple rhythmic thing, anything, or raising their hand, can even cause anxiety for kids. So I find that a lot of my students this year did not start raising their hands and engaging in class discussion until the end of the year, when they knew I was never going to shut them down. There was no right or wrong answers. I really just wanted to hear their thoughts. And once they understood that I do want to hear everyone's thoughts, they were more likely to raise their hand and participate and not be afraid of what people are going to think, or that what they're saying is wrong. So I find that's extremely important to do in music class these days. When I watched the Musical Futures video, it made me think of the response from Unit 1 that the students said they didn't see a connection. I thought this was a perfect example of how music can be relevant and we can help create those connections for students, especially at the secondary level. So that's still that one response from Unit 1 where the kids said they didn't see those connections. This was a perfect example. So I hope those students do get to experience and see those connections. Also with the Musical Futures, the Musical Features, so the online, the first thing to catch my attention was a Just Play along for Eye of the Tiger. I thought that was really cool because I can bring pop music in, and it's a song that students may know, and songs students may not know, but if they ever watch the movie Rocky, it will be in it. So I thought it was the coolest thing when I watched the video, because there were multiple instruments being shown. So a student could choose to do ukulele, could choose to do guitar, piano, so that gives the option of choice and kind of goes back to that informal learning. And in that, the students were working on reading tabs and chord charts, and they were playing in time, which is something that, as an elementary general music teacher, I am constantly talking about steady beat, I'm talking about rhythm, and that does it in a way that doesn't overwhelm students with reading standard notation, because piano is hard, and guitar is hard, ukulele is hard, so they might be focusing on trying to play the right notes, where their fingers are going. So overwhelming some students with rhythms, then, this new instrument can be tough. So I liked that it showed exactly where your fingers should go, what keys to hit, and what frets. I loved that, and it still had them playing in time. So when I was reading and looking around with the Free to Be Musical book, right away, what caught my eye was the blues scale and blues chordal structure chapters or figures. I did an improvisation unit with my high school students, and we did it part of our jazz unit. But the one thing I did was this was a special ed class, a high school special ed class, so I took some of the bars off the xylophones, so I only had the blues scale notes on, and I put on a blues backing chord progression. So that was constantly playing on a loop, and I just had the kids play xylophones, and no matter what they played, it was going to sound good because I picked the notes and made sure that the notes would fit any bar they played. And they loved it. They thought it was great. They were having so much fun. And we did it in a way so I would have group improvise, so they were just improvising on their own. And then I would choose one student, so it'd be a solo improvising section. And then we'd go back to the group, and then we'd stop because it was the 12-bar blues chord progression. So every 12 bars, we would alternate. And the kids loved it, had so much fun, and they had no idea that what they were doing was really improvising. They thought they were just hitting random notes, but once I explained you just improvised and then showed examples, they thought that was so cool that they were able to do that. And I can see it being done at the middle school level. I think I would talk about what notes would work with middle school students rather than just pulling the bars off. Um, like I said, it was a high school special ed class, so that would have overwhelmed them to think about what notes would fit, and things like that. So I think it can be done at the middle school level where you have the students try to figure out what notes exactly would fit without taking the bars off. With the music informal learning in the school, a new classroom pedagogy, right away as I was reading it, I thought about all my friends who are fantastic musicians but never participated in school music ensembles. And this is exactly how they learn their instrument, such as guitar and drums. They would listen to soundtracks and copy what they heard. And they would do jam sessions with friends, and they loved it. And they're fantastic musicians. They're in bands now, and they gig. So they didn't really need school music to be able to do that. But it would be really cool if there was time during the day, their school day, that they could do that. And maybe they would have learned a little bit faster with having a teacher there guiding them. But one of the drawbacks I thought about was that students may not be as fluent when playing while reading music that is written in standard notation, especially if the only way they learn their instrument is and the only way they practice is by just copying what they hear. I've always been jealous of people that had a great ear and could do that, because I definitely rely very heavily on standard notation. And when I was an undergrad, that is something that, my professors would try to get me to work on. They'd say, get outside of your bubble, really listen. And once I did, I was able to blend more and be in the upper ensembles because I showed I could do that. And it's so important. But I still, when doing solo work, relied a lot on standard notation. And I think it's still important for those who do want to do pop music to learn, because if they want to do they have a friend who has a band and their bass player gets sick and you play bass, they may ask you to fill in. And you could do that last minute if you knew their entire set list. But you may not know the entire set list, so it would be comforting if you could at least get some chords written down, or figure out, or even have sheet music for some of the songs, just so you're not going in blind. But I can see that, in pop music these days, that really isn't needed. Standard notation is rarely used. But I still think it's important. We teach it at the elementary level, so why not continue it in the secondary level when students are doing that improvising and jam session-like activities. I agree that doing these jam-type sessions and the informal learning, it does close the gap between different musical cultures and rather focuses on students' own musical cultures. I think that would be helpful in helping students see the connections between music that they do in school and outside music. I kind of hit on this before, but if a community or school district really values traditional pedagogy, then I think you should offer a club that allows any interested students to join and do the informal learning and jam session activities rather than putting it in music class. Another drawback I wrote down was that a lot of time ensembles will meet either before or after school. So you may have that outside school musician, like a violinist, or you might have a pianist who would like to continue their general music in middle school and maybe music theory. So I don't think that this informal learning and the jam sessions should be that the entire class. I think if you want it to be an entire thing on its own, I think a club would be great. And you could have any interested student join. So that way, if they are in band and don't need to take general music, they can still have that opportunity to do, the jam session and informal learning and listening and copying without taking up time in their schedule. And the author kind of said that this approach does not need to substitute formal music education, but it should complement it. So I think a club would better complement it than putting it right in the class. The other thing that was mentioned was that enculturation is definitely a factor that is common in music learning. My father, he plays bass guitar, but he can't read music. He grew up with my grandfather who had a polka band, and everyone in his family had to be part of that polka band because it was the family band. So my dad learned by listening to recordings, copying, and things like that. So he still can't read standard notation today. He's trying to work on it because he has been, offered gigs, and they said, oh, we'll just give you, the sheet music or things like that. And so he wanted be able to say yes to those gigs. So he's trying to learn so he can. And that kind of goes back to my point that standard notation is still important because you never know. Another thing with enculturation is we do a lot of call and response when we're teaching kids beginning instruments, especially recorder. That's their first time with an instrument. So right away, we're not going to overwhelm them with, okay, this is G on the staff. You're going to read, the rhythms at the same time as you're trying to figure out where your fingers go and things like that. Yes, we introduce it, here's G, where would it go on the staff? And, using that prior knowledge. But once I have kids blowing a note for the first time, so say the note G, I am going to play first, and then I'm going to have the kids repeat and echo what I just did. So that way they're not overwhelmed, and it's kind of breaking it up into smaller chunks. And I thought that was an example of enculturation because, they're copying and they're just being kind of thrown into it and playing. But another drawback I had with this example with the jam sessions and having students pick their own music is you have to be really careful that students are picking school appropriate music, and that you got to watch that kids aren't going to get bullied for their choices. Middle school is, the first preteen age, and, hormones are all around, and so they're really sensitive at that age, and they really do think about what their peers think about them and say about them. So just making sure that it is a welcoming environment, but making sure that outside the classroom the kid's not getting bullied, and they're not, being rude and disrespectful about their taste in music, because that can really, hurt a kid's self-esteem. But also you want to make sure that this child is picking music that actually they value and enjoy, and not just something because their friends told them to do that. So just watching for that. And then with the making sure it's appropriate, you have to be very careful that you don't tell a kid something's inappropriate or it's wrong, because at home that might not be considered inappropriate or wrong. And you don't want their home values, to be seen as negative or bad, because that's just where they come from. But you want to make sure that they understand that maybe it's not the best choice for a school setting and why it might not be the best choice. Because just automatically telling a kid no and, not really explaining why without hurting the home values could be really bad. But overall, I think it's a great idea because it does allow self-expression through music when the kids are picking songs that, they might be feeling at the moment, and things like that. But I do think it would be better if it were a club than maybe a class. But that's just my thoughts. Let me know what you think. And that's my reflection on Unit 2.